Marcus Wellington adjusted his Italian silk tie as his black Mercedes pulled through the ornate iron gates of his sprawling estate. The 45-year-old tech mogul had built his fortune from nothing, turning a small software company into a billion-dollar empire that dominated 3 continents. His mansion sat on 50 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the most exclusive neighborhood of Atlanta, a testament to his incredible success story. The house itself was a marvel of modern architecture mixed with classical elegance. 32 rooms spread across 4 levels, each decorated with priceless art and furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Marcus had worked 18-hour days for 20 years to afford this life, and he wore his wealth like armor against the poverty he had known as a child. As his driver opened the car door, Marcus stepped onto the marble driveway and breathed in the crisp autumn air. He had just returned from a week-long business trip to Tokyo, where he had closed a deal worth $300 million. The negotiations had been brutal, but Marcus thrived on such challenges. Competition energized him, and winning deals like this one reminded him why he had clawed his way out of the housing projects where he grew up. "Welcome home, Mr. Wellington," said James, his elderly butler, who appeared at the front door with practiced timing. James had worked for the family for 8 years and knew Marcus's routines perfectly. "Thank you, James. How did everything go while I was away?" Marcus asked, handing over his briefcase as they walked through the grand foyer. The chandelier above them sparkled with Austrian crystal, casting rainbow patterns on the white marble floor. "Very smoothly, sir. Mrs. Rodriguez maintained the gardens beautifully, and the staff kept everything running perfectly. Your sister called twice, and there are several documents waiting for your signature in the study." Marcus nodded absently. His mind was already shifting from the Tokyo deal to the next challenge. Tomorrow he had a board meeting where he would present his plans for expanding into the European market. The presentation would determine whether his company could acquire 3 smaller firms in Germany and France. After changing into casual clothes, Marcus decided to walk around his property. This had become his ritual after long trips, a way to reconnect with what he had built and remind himself of how far he had come. The grounds were spectacular, designed by the same landscape architect who had created gardens for European royalty. Every tree, every flower bed, every stone pathway had been planned to create a sense of peaceful luxury. As he walked past the Olympic-sized swimming pool, Marcus remembered the public pool in his old neighborhood. Marcus was known for his incredible work ethic and his ability to stay connected no matter where he was or what time it was. He employed over 30,000 people across his various companies, and their livelihoods depended on his decisions. This responsibility weighed on him constantly, driving him to work even harder. Walking toward the back of the property, Marcus admired the rose garden that his landscaping team maintained year-round. The roses were imported from Ecuador and required special care to bloom in Georgia's climate. Each bush had cost more than many families spend on groceries in a month, but Marcus believed that excellence required investment. Everything in his life reflected this philosophy. The vegetable garden had been his wife Sarah's idea before their divorce 3 years ago. She had wanted to grow organic vegetables for their dinner parties, though they rarely had time to cook meals at home. After the divorce, Marcus had kept the garden mostly out of habit. The staff maintained it, and occasionally the kitchen used the vegetables, but it felt like a reminder of what he had lost in his pursuit of success. Sarah had left him because she said he loved money more than he loved her. Marcus had argued that everything he did was for their family, for their future children, for the security that money could provide. But Sarah had wanted time and attention, things that Marcus struggled to give when there were always deals to close and companies to acquire. As he rounded the corner near the garden shed, Marcus stopped in his tracks. Someone was kneeling in the grass near the edge of the vegetable garden, and they appeared to be eating something from the ground. His first thought was that an intruder had somehow gotten past his security system, but as he moved closer, he realized it was one of his staff members. The woman was wearing the simple uniform of his housekeeping staff, a navy blue dress with white trim. She was African American, probably in her 50s, and she was carefully picking small plants from the ground and eating them. Marcus recognized her as Elena Rodriguez, though he realized he had never actually spoken to her directly. She had worked for his family for about 3 years, always quiet and efficient in her duties. Marcus felt a mixture of confusion and irritation. His staff was well paid and had access to full meals during their shifts. The kitchen was always stocked with high-quality food, and his employees were welcome to eat lunch there every day. Why would anyone be eating grass from his garden like some kind of animal? His first instinct was to call security and have Elena removed from the property immediately. This behavior was bizarre and unprofessional. What if guests saw a member of his staff eating grass? It would be humiliating and could damage his reputation. Marcus had worked too hard to build his image to allow something like this to tarnish it. But something stopped him from reaching for his phone. There was something about Elena's careful movements that suggested this wasn't random or crazy behavior. She was selecting specific plants, examining them closely before eating them. She looked around nervously, clearly trying not to be seen. This wasn't the behavior of someone who was mentally unstable or trying to cause problems. Marcus decided to observe for a few more minutes before taking action. He positioned himself behind a large oak tree where he could watch without being seen. Elena continued her careful selection and consumption of various plants from around the garden area. She moved methodically, as if she knew exactly what she was looking for. After watching for 10 minutes, Marcus saw Elena carefully clean her hands with a small cloth she pulled from her pocket. She smoothed down her uniform and checked to make sure no dirt or grass stains were visible. Then, she walked back toward the house with the same quiet dignity she always displayed while working. Marcus stood behind the oak tree for several more minutes, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. Elena had been with his family for 3 years. James had hired her after his previous head of housekeeping retired, and her references had been excellent. She was known for her attention to detail and her reliability. She had never caused any problems or given anyone reason for concern. The more Marcus thought about it, the more questions arose in his mind. Was Elena stealing food from his property because she was hungry? That seemed impossible. His staff was well compensated, and they had access to meals during their shifts. Was this some kind of cultural practice he didn't understand? Was she taking these plants home to use for cooking or medicine? Marcus realized that despite living in the same house for 3 years, he knew almost nothing about Elena as a person. He didn't know if she had family, where she lived, what her life was like outside of work. This struck him as odd, considering how much time she spent in his home, cleaning his personal spaces and handling his belongings. Walking back toward the house, Marcus tried to remember any previous interactions with Elena. She was always polite and professional, greeting him with a quiet, "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," when their paths crossed. She kept his bedroom spotless, organized his closet perfectly, and never disturbed anything important. But they had never had a real conversation. This realization bothered Marcus more than he expected. He prided himself on being a good employer, offering competitive wages and benefits to all his staff. He had always assumed that his employees were happy and well-treated. The possibility that Elena might be struggling with something serious enough to drive her to eat grass from his garden challenged his assumptions about his own generosity and awareness. In the house, Marcus found James polishing silverware in the dining room. "James, tell me about Elena Rodriguez. How is she doing? Any concerns about her work or her situation?" James looked up with mild surprise. "Elena? She's excellent, sir. Very reliable, very thorough. Never misses a day unless she's truly ill." "Why do you ask?" "Just checking in on the staff. You know I like to make sure everyone is doing well." Marcus tried to keep his tone casual, not wanting to reveal what he had witnessed. "She's actually one of our most dependable employees, Mr. Wellington. Always arrives early, stays late if needed, never complains about extra work. A real professional. Her references when we hired her were outstanding. Does she have family? Kids? I want to make sure our benefits package is meeting everyone's needs." James paused in his polishing, clearly thinking carefully about how much personal information to share. "I believe she has a daughter, sir. College-aged, if I remember correctly. Elena is very private about her personal life, but she did mention once that she was putting her daughter through school." This information added another layer to the mystery. If Elena was supporting a daughter's college education, she would need every penny of her salary. College costs had skyrocketed, and even with a good job, many families struggled to afford higher education. But this still didn't explain the grass-eating behavior. Marcus spent the evening in his study. Trying to focus on the board meeting consumed Marcus's morning with the intensity he had expected. 12 executives gathered in the glass-walled conference room on the 20th floor of Wellington Enterprises, reviewing acquisition plans that would expand the company's reach into 3 European markets. Marcus presented his research with the confidence that had made him legendary in business circles, but part of his mind remained distracted by thoughts of Elena. When the meeting concluded with unanimous approval for the European expansion, Marcus felt the familiar rush of victory. This deal would create 2,000 new jobs and increase company revenues by 40% over the next 3 years. It represented everything he had worked for: growth, success, and the power to shape markets across continents. But as he drove home through Atlanta's afternoon traffic, Marcus found himself thinking about Elena's daughter in college instead of celebrating his latest triumph. How much did college cost these days? Even with a good salary, could a single mother really afford tuition, room, board, and all the other expenses that came with higher education? Marcus realized he had been out of touch with financial reality for most people. When his own business had started generating serious money, he had lost track of what things actually cost for regular families. His monthly wine budget probably exceeded what many people spent on groceries. His car payments were more than some people's annual salaries. Arriving home, Marcus changed into casual clothes and walked through the house looking for Elena. He found her in the library, carefully dusting the leather-bound books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She worked with methodical precision, treating each book as if it were precious, though Marcus realized he rarely read any of them anymore. "Elena," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned around quickly, clearly surprised to be addressed directly by the homeowner. "Yes, Mr. Wellington. Is there something you need? I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes. Would you mind taking a break?" Elena's expression became cautious. In her experience, when employers wanted to talk, it usually meant problems. She set down her dusting cloth and stood with her hands folded in front of her, waiting. "Please, sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to one of the reading chairs. "This isn't about work performance. You do excellent work. I just realized that in 3 years, I've never really gotten to know you as a person." Elena remained standing. "I prefer to keep my personal life separate from work, Mr. Wellington. It's more professional that way. I understand that. But I'm curious about how you're doing, whether the job is working well for you, if there's anything you need that we're not providing." "The job is fine, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity." Marcus could see that Elena was being carefully polite, giving him the answer she thought he wanted to hear. This was exactly the kind of professional distance that had kept him from understanding what was really happening in his employee's life. "Elena, yesterday I saw you in the garden. You were eating some plants near the vegetable area." The change in Elena's expression was immediate and dramatic. Color drained from her face, and her hands trembled slightly. She looked like someone who had been caught doing something shameful. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wellington. I know I shouldn't have done that. It won't happen again." "I'm not angry," Marcus said quickly. "I'm concerned. Can you help me understand what was happening?" Elena looked down at her hands, clearly struggling with whether to explain or simply accept whatever consequences were coming. After a long moment, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Those plants, they're medicinal. My grandmother taught me about them when I was young in El Salvador. Some of them help with pain, others with digestion, others with energy when you haven't eaten much." "You haven't eaten much?" Marcus asked gently. Elena's silence stretched uncomfortably long. Marcus could see her weighing her options, deciding how much truth she could afford to share with her employer. "Elena, I promise you won't lose your job over this conversation. I'm trying to understand, not to punish you." "It's not that I don't have food," Elena said carefully. "It's that sometimes I have to choose between buying groceries and paying other bills. The plants help when grocery money has to go somewhere else." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What other bills?" "My daughter Maria is in her junior year at Emory University. She's studying to be a doctor. The loans only cover part of her costs, and I pay the rest. Tuition, books, housing, it's very expensive." "How expensive?" "About $70,000 a year for everything. The loans cover maybe half of that." Marcus did quick math in his head. Elena was paying $35,000 a year for her daughter's education. Her annual salary was $48,000. After taxes, She was probably taking home around $36,000. That meant nearly all of her income was going to her daughter's education. Elena, how are you living on what's left? I have a small apartment across town. Very basic. I take the bus to work to save on gas and car maintenance. I buy food when I can, but Maria's education comes first. The plants from your garden help when money is tight. The full picture was becoming clear, and Marcus felt sick. While he had been celebrating $300 million deals, his employee had been eating weeds from his garden to survive. She had been choosing between feeding herself and investing in her daughter's future. Why didn't you ask for help? We could have arranged something. Elena looked at him with an expression that was patient but sad. Mr. Wellington, with respect, people in your position don't usually want to hear about employees' financial problems. I have a job, I do it well, and I'm grateful. Asking for more money would seem ungrateful. But you're not just asking for more money. You're struggling to eat. Many people struggle, sir. I'm not special. At least I have work, and my daughter is getting an education that will change her life. That's what matters. Marcus sat down heavily in one of the reading chairs. Elena's dignity in the face of her hardship was overwhelming. She had been sacrificing her own basic needs to invest in her daughter's future, and she had never complained or asked for help. Tell me about Maria, Marcus said. For the first time, Elena's face lit up with genuine pride. She's brilliant, Mr. Wellington. Always been the smartest person in any room. She wants to be a pediatric surgeon. She volunteers at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and the doctors there say she has real talent. She could save so many children's lives. What's her major? Pre-med with a focus on biochemistry. She maintains a 4.0 GPA while working part-time in the campus bookstore. She sends me every grade report, every test score. I keep them all. Marcus thought about his own college experience. His parents had worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, but they had never had to choose between food and tuition. Even in their poverty, there had always been enough for basic needs. Elena, how long have you been eating plants from the garden? About 6 months. That's when Maria's expenses went up for her advanced courses. More books, lab fees, research materials. I started looking for ways to save money, and I remembered what my grandmother taught me about edible plants. You've been hungry for 6 months. Not hungry exactly, just careful about food. The plants help with nutrition, and they don't cost anything. Marcus stood up and walked to the window overlooking the garden where he had first seen Elena. The irony was staggering. He was surrounded by more wealth than most people could imagine, while the woman who cleaned his house was foraging for food on his property. Elena, I want to help. We need to figure out a solution here. I don't want charity, Mr. Wellington. I want to earn what I get. This isn't charity. You work incredibly hard, and you've been dealing with an impossible financial situation with more grace than I've ever seen. We can restructure your compensation or find additional responsibilities that justify higher pay. Elena was quiet for a long moment. My daughter doesn't know about the plants. She would insist on dropping out of school if she knew what I was sacrificing. Her education is the most important thing. What if we could solve this without Maria having to know anything about your current situation? How? Marcus was already forming a plan. What if we created a scholarship program through Wellington Enterprises? We could provide educational funding for employees' children who meet certain academic criteria. Maria's grades certainly qualify her. That would be very generous. But what? Programs like that usually come with strings attached. Requirements, obligations, contracts. I don't want Maria to feel trapped by someone else's money. Marcus realized that Elena's concern was valid. Many corporate scholarship programs did come with commitments to work for the company after graduation or other restrictions. But this situation called for something different. What if it was simpler than that? What if we just covered her remaining education costs, no strings attached, as part of our commitment to supporting exceptional students? Why would you do that? Marcus looked at Elena's face and saw decades of hard work, sacrifice, and dignity. Because it's the right thing to do. Because you've been working in my house for 3 years, taking care of my belongings and my personal space, while secretly struggling to feed yourself. That's not the kind of employer I want to be. I never wanted you to feel obligated. I don't feel obligated, Elena. I feel ashamed that I didn't notice sooner. I feel grateful that you trusted me enough to explain what was happening. And I feel inspired by your commitment to your daughter's future. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Maria wants to specialize in pediatric surgery for children from low-income families. She says too many kids don't get the medical care they need because their parents can't afford it. She sounds remarkable. She is. She's everything I hoped she could become when I brought her to this country. All the sacrifice has been worth it to give her opportunities one never had. Marcus thought about his own definition of success. He had always measured it in dollars, in deals closed, in market share gained. But Elena had a different kind of success. She had raised a daughter who was brilliant, compassionate, and dedicated to helping others. She had given up her own comfort to invest in someone else's future. Elena, I'd like to meet Maria. Would you be comfortable with that? She's very busy with her studies. I'm not thinking about anything formal. Maybe she could join us for dinner sometime. I'd like to understand more about her goals and her experiences. Elena hesitated. She might ask questions about how you know so much about our situation. We'll figure out what to tell her. But I think it's important for me to understand the impact of what we're discussing. Mr. Wellington, why are you doing this? Really? Marcus considered the question carefully. Because yesterday I thought I understood what success meant. I thought providing jobs and paying fair wages was enough. But seeing you eating plants from my garden made me realize that I don't really know anything about the people whose lives intersect with mine. You're not responsible for my choices. Maybe not. But I am responsible for creating an environment where good people can thrive. If you've been struggling this much while working for me, then I need to examine what that says about how I treat the people who work so hard to make my life comfortable. Elena looked around the library with its thousands of books and expensive furniture. This is a very different world from where I grew up, Mr. Wellington. I never expected anything beyond a fair wage for fair work. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe fair isn't enough when the cost of education and basic living expenses has gotten so out of control. Marcus made a decision. Elena, I want to arrange for Maria's remaining education costs to be covered. But I also want to adjust your salary to reflect the true value of your work. You shouldn't have to choose between eating and investing in your daughter's future. That's very generous, but no buts. This isn't generosity. It's justice. You've been underpaid for the value you provide, and it took me seeing you eat grass to realize that. Elena sat down for the first time since their conversation began. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let us help. Say you'll introduce me to Maria W. 3 weeks later. Marcus sat in his study, reviewing financial reports, when James knocked on the door. Elena's salary increase had been implemented immediately, and the scholarship fund for Maria had been established through the company's charitable foundation. But Marcus found himself thinking about the broader implications of what he had discovered. Sir, Elena's daughter Maria is here. She wanted to thank you personally for the scholarship. Marcus had been looking forward to this meeting since Elena had agreed to introduce them. Please send her in. Maria Rodriguez entered the study with the same quiet dignity her mother displayed, but there was an additional quality, an unmistakable intelligence that seemed to light up the room. She was 21 years old, tall and slender like Elena, with bright eyes that took in every detail of the opulent study. Mr. Wellington, thank you for taking time to meet with me, Maria said, extending her hand with professional confidence. The pleasure is mine, Maria. Please sit down. Your mother has told me wonderful things about your studies. Maria settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk, her posture straight but relaxed. I wanted to thank you personally for the scholarship. It's incredibly generous, and it means more to my family than you probably realize. Actually, I think I'm beginning to understand exactly how much it means. Tell me about your goals in medicine. Maria's face lit up with passion. I want to specialize in pediatric surgery, specifically serving underserved communities. There are too many children who don't receive proper medical care because their families can't afford it or don't have access to quality hospitals. That's quite an ambitious goal. Pediatric surgery is one of the most demanding specialties. I know the challenges. The training is long, the hours are brutal, and the emotional toll is significant. But I've been volunteering at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta for 2 years, and I've seen what happens when talented surgeons dedicate themselves to helping kids. They literally save lives every day. Marcus was impressed by Maria's clarity and determination. What drew you to medicine initially? Personal experience, honestly. When I was 12, I developed appendicitis while we were living in a low-income area with limited healthcare options. The emergency room was overcrowded, and we waited 6 hours before anyone could see me. By then, my appendix had ruptured, and I nearly died from complications. That must have been terrifying for you and your mother. It was. But what stayed with me was the pediatric surgeon who eventually operated on me. Dr. Sarah Chun. She spent extra time explaining everything to my mother in Spanish, made sure we understood the recovery process, and even checked on me personally several times during my hospital stay. She made a strong impression. She changed my life, not just medically, but by showing me what compassionate healthcare looks like. She treated us with dignity even though we couldn't pay for private insurance. That experience taught me that medicine isn't just about treating diseases, it's about treating people. Marcus thought about his own healthcare experiences. As a wealthy man, he had access to the best doctors in the world. He could get appointments immediately, receive cutting-edge treatments, and never worry about the cost. Maria's story reminded him that most people didn't have those luxuries. Your mother mentioned that you maintain a perfect GPA while working part-time. That's impressive. My mother sacrificed everything so I could focus on my education. Working in the campus bookstore helps with small expenses, but I know she's been carrying the real financial burden. This scholarship means she can finally stop worrying about money. Marcus realized that Maria didn't know the full extent of Elena's sacrifices. She didn't know about the plants, the skipped meals, or the impossible choices her mother had been making for months. What do you know about your mother's situation? I know she works very hard and never complains. She's always been my hero. A single mother who came to this country with nothing and built a life for us through sheer determination. But I suspect she's been hiding how difficult things have been financially. What makes you think that? Maria was quiet for a moment, clearly deciding how much to share. Little things. When I call her, she sometimes sounds tired in a way that goes beyond just being busy at work. She started buying generic brands of everything, even things where the quality difference matters. And last month when I visited, her refrigerator was mostly empty except for basic staples. Did you ask her about it? I tried to. But my mother is incredibly proud. She spent my whole life protecting me from financial stress, making sure I could focus on school instead of worrying about money. She would never admit if she was struggling. Marcus was struck by the parallel between Elena's protection of Maria and his own parents' protection of him during his childhood. The difference was that Elena had been facing much more serious deprivation. Maria, your mother is remarkable. But I think you should know that her sacrifices for your education have been even greater than you realize. What do you mean? Marcus considered how much to reveal. Elena had been clear that she didn't want Maria to feel guilty about the cost of her education. But Marcus felt that Maria deserved to understand the full scope of her mother's dedication. Your education costs more than your mother's entire take-home pay. She's been finding very creative ways to make that work. Maria's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. How creative? She's been living on an incredibly tight budget, sometimes going without things that most people consider necessities. Like what? Marcus hesitated. Like adequate food. The color drained from Maria's face. What are you saying? I'm saying your mother has been eating plants from our garden when grocery money had to go toward your school expenses instead. Maria stood up abruptly, her professional composure cracking. She's been starving herself to pay for my tuition? Not starving exactly, but certainly sacrificing her own nutrition. She was very clear that your education was more important than her comfort. Oh my God. Maria began pacing in front of the desk. I had no idea. I knew money was tight, but I thought we were managing. I would have dropped out, gotten loans, found another way. That's exactly why she didn't tell you. She knew you would sacrifice your future to solve her immediate problem. But her health, her well-being. What kind of daughter am I if I let my mother suffer like that? Marcus stood and walked around the desk to face Maria. You're the kind of daughter who worked hard enough to earn a 4.0 GPA while your mother was making incredible sacrifices. You're the kind of daughter who's dedicating your career to helping other families who face the same challenges you've faced. That's not something to feel guilty about. But I should have known. I should have insisted on getting more loans, working more hours, something. Maria, your mother made a choice. She chose to invest in your future because she believed it was the most important thing she could do with her resources. Honoring that choice means succeeding, not dropping out. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded Marcus powerfully of Elena. How did you find out about the plants? I saw her one day and asked. She eventually trusted me enough to explain what was happening. And that's when you decided to create the scholarship? That's when I realized that my definition of being a good employer was completely inadequate. Your mother had been working in my house for 3 years while secretly struggling to eat. And I had no idea. Maria looked around the study with new eyes, taking in the expensive furniture, the art, the obvious signs of extreme wealth. This must have been a shock for you. It was. But it was also educational. I learned that I can't just pay people fairly and assume they're doing well. I need to understand the reality of their lives, especially when the cost of things like education and healthcare keeps rising faster than wages. What happens now? Now you finish your education without financial stress. Your mother can afford to eat well and live comfortably. And I try to figure out whether other people in similar situations need help that I've been too oblivious to notice. Mr. Wellington, this is incredibly generous, but I need to ask, what do you expect in return? Marcus smiled at her directness. I expect you to become the best pediatric surgeon you can be. I expect you to help kids whose families can't afford the best medical care. And I expect you to remember that sometimes the people who work the hardest are invisible to those of us with more resources. That's all. That's everything. Your mother raised you to be someone who will make a real difference in the world. The scholarship just removes some barriers so you can focus on that goal. Maria was quiet for several minutes, processing everything she had learned. I want to pay this forward somehow. Not just by treating patients who can't afford care, but by creating systems that prevent other families from facing these impossible choices. What do you mean? Healthcare costs are out of control, but so are education costs. Maybe there's a way to create sustainable funding for students like me, or maybe there are healthcare delivery models that could serve low-income communities better. Marcus was intrigued. Have you thought about the business side of healthcare? Some. I know that hospitals and medical practices have to be financially viable to survive, but I also think there might be ways to structure things differently. What if excellent medical care could be profitable even when serving patients who can't pay premium prices? That's an interesting question. Have you studied any examples of that kind of model? A little. There are some community health centers that do incredible work on limited budgets. And I've read about medical practices in other countries that provide excellent care at much lower costs than what we see here. Marcus realized that Maria's combination of medical knowledge, personal experience with financial hardship, and obvious intelligence could be incredibly valuable for addressing healthcare problems systemically. Maria, what if the scholarship came with an opportunity for mentorship? Not just financial support, but access to business knowledge that could help you develop those ideas. What kind of mentorship? I know healthcare executives, policy experts, and business leaders who work on exactly these kinds of problems. What if you could spend time learning from them while you complete your medical training? That would be incredible. But why would you invest that much time and effort in my development? Marcus thought about Elena eating plants in his garden while he celebrated million-dollar deals in boardrooms around the world. Because I'm starting to think that real success isn't just about building wealth. It's about using that wealth to solve problems that matter. Your ideas about healthcare delivery could help thousands of families avoid the kind of situation you and your mother have been facing. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept help not just with tuition, but with developing your broader vision for healthcare. Say you'll introduce me to Dr. Chun who inspired you. And say you'll forgive an old businessman for taking so long to notice what was happening in his own house. Mr. Wellington, you're not old. And you're doing more than most people would do in this situation. I'm doing what I should have been doing all along. The question I 6 months after his conversation with Maria, Marcus stood in the conference room of a community health center in East Atlanta, looking at charts and graphs that told stories of struggle he was only beginning to understand. Dr. Sarah Chun, the pediatric surgeon who had inspired Maria's career path, was presenting data about healthcare access in low-income neighborhoods. The average family in this area waits 6 weeks for a routine pediatric appointment. Dr. Chin explained to the group of healthcare administrators, business leaders, and community organizers that Marcus had assembled. For specialist care, the wait can be 3 to 6 months. By then, minor problems often become major emergencies. Marcus had organized these meetings after realizing that Elena and Maria's situation was part of much larger systemic problems. The scholarship had solved their immediate crisis, but thousands of other families faced similar impossible choices every day. If his wealth could make a real difference, he needed to understand the scope of the challenges. "What are the main barriers to faster access?" asked Janet Morrison, a healthcare policy expert Marcus had recruited to help analyze potential solutions. "3 big ones," Dr. Chen replied. "Not enough doctors accepting Medicaid patients, transportation challenges for families without reliable cars, and language barriers that complicate communication with medical staff." Marcus thought about his own medical care. When he needed a specialist, he could see the best doctors in the country within days. His insurance covered everything, and money was never a consideration. The contrast with what Dr. Chun was describing felt almost obscene. What would it cost to address those barriers in a meaningful way? Marcus asked. "That depends on how comprehensive you want to be. A mobile clinic serving this area could cost about $2 million to establish and $500,000 annually to operate. Hiring additional bilingual medical staff for the existing clinic would cost maybe $300,000 per year. Transportation vouchers and childcare support could run another $200,000 annually." Marcus did quick calculations. The total cost would be less than he spent on business entertainment in a typical year. It was a rounding error compared to his recent European acquisition, yet it could transform healthcare access for thousands of people. Elena had been attending these meetings at Marcus's invitation, providing insights from the perspective of families navigating the healthcare system. She had initially been reluctant to participate, feeling that her lack of formal education made her opinions less valuable. But Marcus had insisted that her practical experience was exactly what the group needed to understand. "The transportation problem is bigger than most people realize," Elena said during the discussion. "When Maria had her appendicitis, we took 3 buses to get to the hospital because we didn't have a car and couldn't afford a taxi. The trip took 2 hours, and she was in terrible pain the whole time." "How common is that kind of situation?" Janet asked. "Very common. Most families in my old neighborhood don't have cars or can't afford to miss work for medical appointments. So they wait until kids are really sick before seeking help. And then, it's often too late for simple treatments." Dr. Chen nodded. "We see that pattern constantly. Conditions that could be treated easily with early intervention become complicated cases requiring expensive emergency care." Marcus was beginning to understand that healthcare problems weren't just about individual cases. They were about systems that worked well for people with resources, but failed people without them. The inefficiency was staggering from both human and economic perspectives. "What about the education costs that families like Elena's face?" Marcus asked. "Are there systemic solutions to make higher education more accessible?" Dr. Rodriguez, a financial aid administrator from Emory University whom Marcus had invited to join the discussions, pulled out her own charts. "The cost of higher education has increased by 400% over the past 30 years, while wages have only increased by about 50%. That gap is unsustainable for most families." "What drives those cost increases?" "Multiple factors. Reduced state funding for public universities, increased administrative costs, competition for amenities that students expect, and easy availability of federal loans that allows schools to keep raising prices without losing students." "So the loan system actually makes the problem worse?" "In some ways, yes. Students can borrow enormous amounts of money, which removes market pressure for schools to control costs. But without the loans, most low-income students couldn't attend college at all." Marcus thought about Maria's situation. Even with excellent grades and part-time work, she would have been priced out of medical school without the scholarship. How many other brilliant students were making different choices because their families couldn't afford the sacrifice that Elena had made? What would a sustainable solution look like? "Probably a combination of approaches," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Income-based repayment plans that actually work, more generous need-based aid, partnerships between universities and employers to provide practical training, and maybe alternative pathways to traditional 4-year degrees for some careers." Elena raised her hand tentatively. "Could I ask something?" Of course. Why are we the first group of people to sit in a room and talk about these problems like they might actually be solvable? I've been dealing with these issues for years, and it always felt like they were just facts of life that couldn't be changed. The question hung in the air, and Marcus realized it cut to the heart of something important. These were not new problems, and the solutions they were discussing were not particularly complicated. The barrier had been that people with resources to implement solutions rarely encountered the problems personally. That's an excellent question, Elena, Janet said. I think it's because we live in separate worlds most of the time. People who have power to change systems don't usually experience the consequences of those systems not working. And people who experience the problems don't usually have access to decision makers, Dr. Chen added. Marcus felt the weight of this observation. He had been living 30 minutes away from Elena for 3 years, completely unaware of her daily struggles. How many other people were dealing with similar challenges without any connection to resources that could help? What if we could change that? Marcus asked. What if we created ongoing connections between people who experience these problems and people who have resources to address them? What do you mean? Dr. Rodriguez asked. I mean, what if this conversation didn't end today? What if we built something permanent? A way for families like Elena's to have input into how resources get allocated, and for people with resources to understand the real impact of their decisions. Elena looked skeptical. People with money don't usually want to hear about poor people's problems for very long. It makes them uncomfortable. Maybe that discomfort is necessary, Marcus replied. Maybe I needed to be uncomfortable about your situation to understand how inadequate my previous approach was. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with the group to develop what they called the Community Connection Initiative. The concept was simple but radical. Create ongoing partnerships between wealthy individuals and families facing systemic challenges, with both sides committing to long-term engagement and mutual education. Wealthy participants would commit to understanding specific family situations in depth over at least 1 year. They would attend monthly meetings where community members shared their experiences with healthcare, education, housing, and employment. More importantly, they would commit to using their resources and influence to address the problems they learned about. Community participants like Elena would share their experiences honestly, help design solutions, and provide feedback on whether proposed interventions actually worked. They would also help identify other families facing similar challenges, expanding the network of understanding and support. The pilot program started with 12 wealthy individuals and 12 families. Marcus insisted on rigorous measurement of outcomes, not just how much money was spent, but whether families' actual situations improved in measurable ways. Elena became one of the community coordinators, helping to recruit families and design programming. She had been nervous about taking on such a visible role, but Marcus pointed out that her combination of personal experience and natural wisdom made her uniquely qualified for the position. I never imagined I'd be sitting in boardrooms talking to millionaires about policy, Elena told Marcus one afternoon as they reviewed applications from families wanting to join the program. I never imagined I'd be learning so much from someone I had been employing for 3 years without really knowing, Marcus replied. This is probably how things should have worked all along. It's strange being on this side of things. I spent so long trying to be invisible, just doing my job and not causing problems. Now you want me to be visible, to speak up about problems. Do you think other families like yours are ready to be more visible? Elena considered this carefully. Some are. Others are too scared of losing what little they have. It takes courage to trust that wealthy people actually want to hear the truth instead of just feeling better about themselves. Marcus realized this was a crucial point. For the Community Connection Initiative to work, it had to be about more than charity or feel-good gestures. It had to create real change in systems that affected thousands of people. How do we prove that this is about real change? Results, Elena said simply. If families' lives actually get better, word will spread. If it's just talk and meetings, people will figure that out too. 3 months into the pilot program, the results were encouraging but complex. Medical care access had improved dramatically for participating families through the mobile clinic and transportation support. 5 students had received educational scholarships similar to Maria's. Several families had received help with housing deposits that allowed them to move to safer neighborhoods. But Marcus was learning that individual success stories didn't automatically address systemic problems. The mobile clinic helped families in East Atlanta, but similar communities across the city still lacked access. The scholarships changed trajectories for specific students, but college costs continued rising for everyone else. 2 years after discovering Elena in his garden, Marcus stood before the Atlanta City Council presenting a comprehensive plan that would have seemed impossible during his previous life as a businessman focused solely on profit. The Community Connection Initiative had evolved into something much larger, a model for addressing systemic inequality that was attracting attention from cities across the country. Council members, what we're proposing isn't charity, Marcus said, clicking to the next slide of his presentation. It's an investment in economic efficiency. When families can access healthcare early, when students can afford education without crushing debt, when workers earn enough to meet basic needs, the entire economy benefits. The presentation included data from 2 years of pilot programs. Healthcare costs had dropped by 30% in neighborhoods served by mobile clinics. Educational achievement had increased in schools where students had access to tutoring and college prep support. Crime rates had decreased in areas where employment training programs provided viable alternatives to underground economies. But the most compelling evidence came from the families themselves. Elena sat in the audience next to Maria, who was now in her final year of medical school with a specialty placement at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Their presence represented not just individual success, but the potential for systemic change when barriers were removed strategically. The total cost for citywide implementation would be $42 million annually, Marcus continued. That represents less than 2% of the city's current budget, but it would directly impact over 50,000 families. The economic benefits through reduced emergency room visits, increased tax revenues from higher-earning graduates, and decreased social services costs would offset most of that investment within 3 years. Councilwoman Patricia Williams, representing the district where Marcus had started the pilot programs, leaned forward. Mr. Wellington, this sounds almost too good to be true. What's the catch? The catch is that it requires people with resources to stay engaged with the outcomes instead of just writing checks and walking away. It requires wealthy individuals and successful businesses to see themselves as part of the community instead of separate from it. Can you explain what you mean by that? Marcus looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. 2 years ago, I discovered that one of my employees was eating plants from my garden because she couldn't afford groceries after paying for her daughter's college education. I was paying her what I thought was a fair salary, but I had no idea what her actual life circumstances were. A murmur went through the council chamber. This wasn't the kind of testimony they usually heard from wealthy donors. That experience taught me that good intentions aren't enough. If we want to address poverty and inequality, we need to understand them from the perspectives of people actually experiencing these challenges. This program works because it's designed by community members, not imposed on them. Councilman Robert Hayes looked skeptical. Mr. Wellington, you're asking successful people to fundamentally change how they think about their relationship to the community. Historically, philanthropy has been about wealthy individuals deciding how to help poor people, not the other way around. That's exactly the problem we're trying to solve, Marcus replied. When people with resources make decisions without input from people affected by those decisions, the solutions often miss the mark. Our approach requires ongoing collaboration and shared decision-making. And wealthy people are willing to participate in that kind of arrangement. The 12 families in our pilot program have stayed engaged for 2 years. They've committed not just money, but time and attention. They attend monthly meetings with community families, they visit program sites regularly, and they've changed their own business practices based on what they've learned. Elena stood up in the audience. May I say something? Councilwoman Williams nodded. Please. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I work in Mr. Wellington's house. 2 years ago, I was eating weeds from his garden because I couldn't afford food and college tuition for my daughter. I was too proud to ask for help, and he was too busy to notice I was struggling. The chamber was completely quiet. This program worked for my family because it wasn't about charity. Mr. Wellington didn't just give us money and feel good about himself. He asked me to teach him about what life is really like for people like me. He listened to my ideas about how to solve problems. He treated me like an expert on my own situation. And that made a difference? Councilman Hayes asked. It made all the difference. My daughter Maria is graduating from medical school next month. But, more important, I've been able to help design programs that are working for dozens of other families. We know what the real barriers are because we live with them every day. Maria stood up next to her mother. Council members, I'm Maria Rodriguez. Because of this program, I'll be starting my residency in pediatric surgery in July. But I want you to know that my mother's sacrifice to make my education possible nearly killed her. She was starving herself so I could go to college. The impact of Maria's words was visible throughout the chamber. Several council members looked genuinely shaken. That kind of choice shouldn't be necessary in a wealthy city like Atlanta, Maria continued. This program doesn't just help individual families. It changes systems so other mothers don't have to choose between feeding themselves and investing in their children's futures. Marcus returned to the podium. Maria will be earning over $200,000 a year when she completes her residency. She'll be paying significant taxes, buying a home, contributing to the economy. The city's investment in her education through our scholarship program will be repaid many times over. But, beyond the economic argument, we have a moral obligation to ensure that hardworking families can meet basic needs while pursuing education and opportunity. Elena worked in my house for 3 years while secretly struggling to eat. That's not acceptable in a society that claims to value hard work and personal responsibility. The questions continued for another hour, covering implementation details, funding mechanisms, and oversight procedures. Marcus had prepared thoroughly, but he realized that the most powerful arguments came from Elena and Maria themselves. Their dignity and articulate explanations of their experiences carried more weight than any statistical analysis. After the presentation, Marcus, Elena, and Maria walked through downtown Atlanta toward the restaurant where they had planned to celebrate Maria's upcoming graduation. The evening was warm, and the city's skyline glittered with lights from office buildings where people like Marcus made decisions that affected lives like Elena's. How do you think it went? Elena asked. I think we'll get approval, Marcus replied. But, more importantly, I think we changed some minds about how these programs should work. It's strange being in front of all those powerful people, Maria said. 2 years ago, I would have been intimidated to speak to city council members. Now I feel like I have something important to say to them. You do have something important to say? Your experience gives you authority that none of us can claim. They reached the restaurant, an upscale place that Marcus had chosen partly because he wanted Elena and Maria to experience the kind of establishment where he had spent countless business dinners. But, as they were seated at a table overlooking the city, Marcus realized that this dinner represented something different from his usual professional entertaining. Marcus, Elena said, using his first name as she had started doing during their collaborative work. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you think you would have noticed my situation if you hadn't happened to see me in the garden that day? Marcus considered the question seriously. Honestly, probably not. I was completely focused on my own success, my own challenges, my own world. I had convinced myself that paying fair wages was enough to fulfill my responsibilities as an employer. What changed? Seeing you eating grass broke something open in me. It made me realize that I didn't know anything about the real impact of my choices on other people's lives. I had built this wall around myself where I could feel successful and generous without actually understanding what the people around me were experiencing. And now I know that wealth comes with responsibilities that go far beyond writing checks to charity. If you have resources that could change systems, you have an obligation to understand those systems from the perspectives of people they're currently failing. Maria raised her water glass. I want to propose a toast. To what? To uncomfortable conversations that lead to necessary changes. They touched glasses, and Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon in his garden. Elena was no longer just an employee, but a partner in work that felt more meaningful than any business deal he had ever closed. Maria was about to begin a career that would directly address the healthcare problems they had identified together. But, perhaps most importantly, Marcus had discovered that his wealth could be a tool for justice rather than just comfort. The Community Connection Initiative was now being studied by researchers at 3 universities, and implemented in pilot form in 8 other cities. What had started as a response to one woman's crisis had become a model for addressing systemic inequality. "There's something else I want to share with both of you," Marcus said as their dinner arrived. "I've decided to restructure my entire business approach based on what I've learned through this process." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. "I mean that Wellington Enterprises is going to start evaluating every business decision based on its impact on communities, not just on profit margins. We're going to ensure that our suppliers pay living wages, that our facilities serve the communities where they're located, and that our growth contributes to shared prosperity instead of increased inequality." "That's a big change for a company your size," Maria observed. "It is. But I've learned that you can't address systemic problems with charity while your business practices contribute to creating those same problems. Real change requires consistency between your values and your operations." "What do your investors think about that?" Marcus smiled. "Some of them are nervous, but others are interested in the model we're developing. It turns out that businesses focused on community impact often perform better financially than those focused solely on profit extraction." Elena looked thoughtful. "You know, Marcus, I think you've discovered something that my grandmother tried to teach me about those medicinal plants I was eating in your garden." "What's that?" "She used to say that plants growing in healthy soil are stronger and more useful than plants growing in depleted soil. Maybe businesses and communities work the same way. When you invest in the health of the whole system, everything in it becomes more successful." Marcus was struck by the wisdom of this observation. "So the choice isn't between helping others and helping yourself. It's between short-term extraction and long-term sustainability." "Exactly. What you're doing now isn't charity. It's good farming." As they continued their conversation, Marcus realized that his journey from successful businessman to engaged citizen was far from complete. Each answer led to new questions. Each solution revealed additional challenges. But for the first time in his adult life, he felt like his work was aligned with his values and connected to something larger than his own success. The woman he had seen eating grass in his garden had taught him that real wealth wasn't measured in what you could buy for yourself, but in what you could help others achieve for themselves and their communities. That lesson would guide his decisions for the rest of his life, ensuring that his resources served justice rather than just comfort. 2 years later, Maria Rodriguez, MD, would open a community health clinic in the neighborhood where she had grown up, providing pediatric care to families who couldn't afford traditional medical services. Elena Rodriguez would become the director of community partnerships for Wellington Enterprises, helping other companies develop authentic relationships with the communities they served. And Marcus Wellington would continue learning that the most important discoveries often happen not in boardrooms or business schools, but in conversations with people whose experiences challenge everything you thought you knew about success, responsibility, and what it truly means to build something meaningful with the resources you've been given. "We're playing defense," Marcus told the group during a quarterly review meeting. "We're helping individual families, which is important, but we're not changing the underlying systems that create these problems." "What would playing offense look like?" Dr. Chen asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I think it means using our resources and influence to change policies, not just treat symptoms." Elena nodded. "Maria says the same thing about medicine. You can treat individual patients all day, but if the environment that makes people sick doesn't change, you'll never get ahead of the problem." Marcus realized that his transformation from successful businessman to engaged citizen was far from complete. He had learned to see problems that had been invisible before, and he had started addressing them with individual solutions. But the next phase would require him to use his wealth and influence in ways that challenged the systems he had previously accepted without question. The conversation with Elena about grass in his garden had led him to a much larger understanding of responsibility, privilege, and the potential for meaningful change. But it had also shown him how much more he still needed to learn about using wealth as a tool for justice rather than just comfort. Whether it's enough, and whether we can figure out how to help other people who might be struggling in ways that aren't visible. As their conversation concluded, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his business success. Maria represented something more than an individual success story. She represented the possibility that intelligent, compassionate people could solve systemic problems if they had the right support and opportunities. But he also realized that Elena and Maria's situation probably wasn't unique. How many other families were making impossible choices between basic needs and future opportunities? How many other employees, suppliers, or community members were struggling while he remained focused on stock prices and profit margins? Marcus made a decision. The scholarship for Maria was just the beginning. It was time to start asking harder questions about the impact of his wealth and the responsibilities that came with his success, and she has time. And say you'll never feel like you have to eat plants from my garden instead of asking for what you need. Mr. Wellington, this changes everything. I hope so, because everything needed to change. As they talked through the practical details of adjusting Elena's compensation and covering Maria's education costs, Marcus felt something shifting in his understanding of wealth and responsibility. Money wasn't just about what you could buy for yourself. It was about the power to change lives, to remove barriers, to create opportunities. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like his success might actually mean something beyond numbers on a balance sheet. Preparing for tomorrow's board meeting. But his mind kept returning to the image of Elena carefully selecting and eating plants from his garden. The more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. Not because he was angry, but because he felt like he was missing something important. He pulled up Elena's employment file on his computer. Her salary was competitive for the area, and she had full health insurance through the company plan. Her performance reviews were consistently excellent. She had perfect attendance except for 2 days when she had been genuinely sick. On paper, she looked like the ideal employee. But Marcus realized that he knew nothing about the reality of Elena's life outside these basic facts. He didn't know where she lived, how far she commuted to work, what her family situation was really like, or whether she had any financial pressures that weren't obvious from her employment records. As he prepared for bed, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow, after his board meeting, he would find a way to speak with Elena privately. He needed to understand what he had witnessed and whether there was something he should be doing differently as her employer. The image of her eating grass from his garden had shaken something loose in his understanding of his own life and responsibilities. Marcus Wellington had always believed that success meant having enough money to solve any problem. But as he fell asleep in his king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, he wondered if there were problems in his own house that money alone couldn't fix, and whether his pursuit of wealth had blinded him to realities that were happening right under his nose. The next morning would bring answers that would change everything he thought he knew about success, responsibility, and what it truly meant to take care of the people whose lives intersected with his own.